It is an honor to introduce our next speaker, Professor Jonathan Plucker. Professor Plucker is a prominent education policy and talent development scholar, the Julian C. Stanley Endowed Professor of Talent Development at Johns Hopkins University, and works in both the Center for Talented Youth and School of Education. Maybe you didn't know that he received his bachelor's degree in chemistry education. Then he received a master's degree and his doctorate in educational psychology. His research examines creativity, education policy, the excellence gap, and talent development, with over 200 publications to his credit. His books include From Giftedness to Gifted Education with Anne Rim and Matt Mako, and Excellence Gaps in Education with Scott Peters. In addition, Professor Plucker is the current president of the National Association for Gifted Children in the USA. Ezt egy még egyszer. In addition, Professor Plucker is the current president of the National Association for Gifted Children in the United States. His work of defining and studying the excellence gap is part of a larger effort to reorient the thinking of policymakers and educators towards how to best promote success and high achievement for all children. His presentation today will be about the excellence gap and what we know about its causes and solutions. His lecture will be followed by a discussion about the topic. Jonathan, we are glad that you are with us today. Please share your thoughts.
It's a pleasure to join you today for this keynote. I'm really excited to talk to everyone about excellence gaps and all the work that my colleagues and I have done on this topic over the past 12 to 14 years or so. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to jump right into things here. Let me share my screen. All right, great. So my colleagues and I have been studying excellence gaps now for about 14 years. Our first report came out about 12 years ago. And I'm going to hit some highlights, but I'm mostly going to focus today on things we've learned over the past decade with a tight focus on interventions, because that's what we all want to do, right, is to solve these problems. And we've learned so much about interventions over the last 5 or 6 years. And I'm going to go quickly because of the time, but I am always happy to jump on Zoom or email if anyone wants to discuss these issues further or have me guest lecture to classes, anything like that. The very last slide has all of my contact information. I always like to start by grounding things a bit. The National Association for Gifted Children here in the US has a strategic plan that focuses on changing minds, changing policies, and changing practices. This work cuts across all 3 of these areas. I'm especially going to be talking about changing practices today. That's going to be most of our time. The primary ECHA aim is to promote research, development, and education in the field of high ability. To me, that's what studying excellence gaps is all about. That sentence right there. And so we are really going to focus today on the core aim of ECHA. I do want to make sure that I thank colleagues, friends, organizations that have been very supportive of this work. We've done a lot of it, and it absolutely couldn't have happened without lots of people's help. So thank you. I'm sure I've left people off of this. We just know that I am grateful. All right. So the 21st century is boy, do we have problems in the world, right? We have problems that really need solutions. We need talent like we have never needed talent before, even before the pandemic, but certainly things like global warming, terrorism, food shortages and famine, and all interrelated issues. We have big problems that have to be solved. And it really is amazing if you think about it. In less than 12 months, we created not one, but several vaccines that appear to have over 90% efficacy. And we've been getting the vaccines into people's bodies for a couple months now. Even 5 years ago, that would have been almost impossible, if not completely impossible. It is truly a medical miracle, but it's not really a miracle, right? It's really talented people, supported well, doing great work all over the world. I should also note that most of the vaccines have been international collaborations. Pfizer is people in Germany, Ireland, the States, all working together. All of them have been, and we need talent. And that's a very important thing. At the same time, a lot of the skills that we valued have sort of changed. Things like communication, collaboration, creative problem solving. It is hard to imagine being successful in life and moving forward if you don't have a decent grasp of those skill sets. So just how we think about talent has changed at the same time. And that certainly involves rethinking who is talented. Generally, advanced students tend to come from upper income families. That's true in every single country. So a huge point of this work has really been to focus on how do we promote the achievement of low-income advanced students. Our very rough estimate is that in this country alone, and the United States student population is roughly the size of Europe's student population, we estimate that there's at least 1 million K-12 students every year who are not performing at advanced levels, but certainly could if they were supported differently. I suspect that the number is the same in Europe too, and in most countries. This is a very large number of students who could be performing at the highest levels, but they are not. That to us is an excellence gap problem. And I sort of came up with this concept around the turn of this current century. I wasn't doing so much gifted ed or so much creativity work. I was doing lots of education policy work, working with politicians and other policymakers to try to create laws and policies that provided more opportunity for students. Around that time, the concept of achievement gaps became very, very popular. It was talked about widely, and it was amazing to me how everyone, at least in my country, started to focus on achievement gaps, achievement gaps, achievement gaps, achievement gaps. And it totally changed the whole national discourse about what education was and what it could be. I started thinking about it that the way that they talked about achievement gaps, but what they really meant was sort of minimal achievement or minimum competency gaps. It was that there were big differences based on student income, class, race, ethnicity in terms of achievement at the basic level of competency. And I want to be very, very clear. We have an ethical imperative to get every student to minimum competency. But for many of our students, minimum competency is exactly that. It is the minimum level, and they have probably come to school already surpassing that level. I also think we have an ethical responsibility then to help them achieve all that they can achieve if we give them the customary supports. Customary isn't the right word, but so that's where we came up with excellence gaps. So if you're concerned about achievement gaps, and we have them in every single country, you should also be focused on excellence gaps. These gaps between demographic groups of students at the top end. We first published this work in our first report in 2010, Mind the Other Gap. Yes, I was on the London subway system when I came up with that title. So give our UK friends credit. And we have published numbers of different articles, reports, books on this topic now, and we are still very, very active. We're working on at least a half dozen different projects now on it. And again, I want to thank everyone who has funded us, supported us, collaborated with us on it. As a result of all of this work, we have learned so much about how to close excellence gaps. And if you want copies of any of the stuff that we've done, please just let me know. So very, very quickly. Oh, and I do want to thank ECHA and High Ability Studies were the first journal to actually publish this work. So we are very, very grateful for that support. I'm just going to give you a very quick example. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to give you a very quick example of what of how we think about excellence gaps, just to kind of drive this home. And so NAEP is the American National Test. It is voluntary, but it's considered to be a pretty solid achievement test. This is the percentage of students in grade 4 math who score in the advanced range. The top group are students who are not low income. The bottom group are students who are low income. This is the percentage of students who have passed. So over a long period of time, we have seen some increases in that top group. Substantial increases. If I went back a little bit further to the left here, this 9% was about 4% around the year, I think, 2001. So we've done a better job. However, for students on the bottom end of that, we've seen a small increases. The last test, 2019, I don't have it on the slide, but it is essentially flatlined or gone down. And it's the same if we break it out by race or ethnicity. The top group, Asian Americans, the second group, white students, and then the three that are all sort of jumbled together at the bottom, Hispanic, Native American, and Black students. When we've looked at international data, very similar patterns across countries. So this should not be surprising to anyone. This is what we talk about when we talk about these gaps. 3% performing advance versus 11% versus 23%. Those are huge gaps, and those are gaps, if you look at the trends, that have grown over time. And they're growing because certain groups, and I can go back to the previous slide too, certain groups have done better, but others have largely stagnated, So when people say, oh, gifted kids can take care of themselves, I always say, oh yeah, absolutely. They're not, but you could say that. And so the data just do not support that. If you support students, if you support advanced students, they will do well. If you don't support them, they will not. And in most of our countries, we are not supporting low-income gifted students. That's why we're seeing lots of these problems. So the big implication is that we can predict with a high accuracy that a talented student who is disadvantaged in some way will not perform at advanced levels in K-12 education. This is true across countries. I once used the phrase permanent talent underclass. And I had several colleagues criticize me for it because they said it was just way too pessimistic. So now we say persistent talent underclass. But I would argue if it persists across generations, it is probably pretty permanent. It is probably pretty permanent. So call it what call it what you will. We all have excellence gap problems. What have we learned? Again, this is a really a very quick overview. Some of the causes, just lack of advanced opportunities. I think we all know that there are huge opportunity gaps. They all feed into these excellence gaps. Poverty, economic deprivation. I mean, we have studied largely using UNICEF data, looking at different countries and their essentially their child poverty mitigation strategies. It doesn't seem to have a huge impact on excellence gaps, but there's no question that huge childhood poverty problems, especially in countries like Japan, United States, Italy, that don't have a lot of programs aimed at helping those students. That's just a problem, and that's a cause of this. As my colleagues Scott Peters and Karen excuse me, Karen Rambo Hernandez have pointed out, these excellence gaps, they may get bigger as students get older, but they are in place as soon as students hit preschool. We already see excellence gaps, and that's a poverty problem for the most part. Not completely, but a huge part of it. And then, of course, social capital. Parents who know the school system, know how to access educational services, social services, they have a huge advantage in providing for their students. And we just tend to forget that if your family is stuck in sort of that cycle of generational poverty, yeah, you probably don't have much social capital. That you don't know how that system works. You don't have, uh, uh, upper income, highly plugged in network that knows, friends who can do you favors and things like that. You just don't have those things, and that is a tremendous barrier to high achievement. I'm going to talk very quickly about a study that we did that came out of this work, because we often have people say things, quite frankly, they just don't believe that lower income students can really achieve at those highest levels. I believe that is selling those students short. We have plenty of studies now that provide the provide the opposite evidence. And but here's a study that that I did with Matt, Michael, Scott, and Karen. And it came out of this work. We had a policymaker, as we were talking to them about excellence gaps, ask us how many students start the school year working above grade level. And we realized we didn't have data on that point. And so we came up with this study. And you're all European, so I'm going to assume that everyone knows what the zone of proximal development is, right? That's where we want students to be. We want them to be challenged, but not over-challenged. And for most bright students, under-challenge is a huge problem. We study this 100 different ways, small exaggeration only. And this is roughly what we found. So this is the percent of students who start the school year this many grade levels ahead. So 2% in math start the year 1 grade level ahead. So this would be 4th grade students on the first day of 4th grade. They showed us on the previous year's testing that they are working at the 5th grade level. So it's a very conservative definition of above grade level. So these numbers are likely underestimates. But then that number, 5% or 2 years or more ahead, 3 years ahead is 4%, 4 or more years, 2%. The numbers are higher within reading. We have pretty good guesses on why those numbers are actually higher. But if you add them up, more than a third of American students show up to school in grades 3 through 8 every year, first day of school, and they already know everything that's going to be taught for the next year, if not the next several years. You talk about under-challenged. That is under-challenged. These numbers make policymakers sit up and think, ooh, maybe we're not doing enough for these students. And they're right. That's why we did the study. Excuse me. I'm going to skip that for now. Our big takeaway from the study is that students performing above grade level are not rare. And we found evidence that every classroom in my country likely has those students. I don't want to get into the weeds about why we're concluding that, but this it's a stereotype, right? That if you have students who live in extreme poverty, at least in this country, they tend to be clustered together into the same urban and also rural schools. That you don't have students there who are already working at the advanced level. We found the exact opposite, that they were in all of these classrooms. People just weren't looking for them. And so they weren't getting those opportunities. And surprisingly enough, they weren't moving further and further ahead. Again, every single classroom probably has these students, So in my last few minutes here, we've already talked about that. The last thing that we focused on are interventions. And it really has been amazing how people have been focusing on equity issues, achievement gaps within gifted ed, advanced ed. I have never seen such an explosion of just really helpful intervention studies as we've had these past few years, and there are several exciting ongoing studies. We are learning so much, and Scott Peters and I, when we wrote our book back in 2016, we went out to actually look and see where the field was, and this is the model that we came up with. I have to say, that was 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago when we submitted the book to the publisher. And we have learned so much more since then. The model, we think, is still holds true. You have to have realistic opportunities. You should always be screening universally and probably using local norms. You should be doing some forms of within or between class ability grouping. If you have educational accountability systems, monitoring systems within your country, they have to reward schools for closing excellence gaps. Obviously, we always need better educator support and training. Psychosocial interventions don't seem to work all that well, interestingly enough, but there's more evidence that they work with older students. But I'm not going to have time to get into all of these. I do want to dive into the screening with local norms, because that is a hot topic. It's very controversial. And again, we have done some recent studies. There aren't many arguments against universal screening. A cost is always a factor. I think we can get caught up too much in, we tend to forget that assessments, high stakes assessments tend to correlate with each other very, very highly. We don't normally talk about that, but you probably already have universal data on most students. Why not just use it and examine it carefully? What I have found working with school districts is that it's not that they don't have universal data, it's that they don't look at it for every student. If you have universal data, look at it universally. It's something that simple can make a huge difference within schools to actually find these talented students. There are lots of arguments against local norms. Portability is one, and the other is that if you use local norms, you will lower standards. Local norms is basically saying that you're not looking at sort of students who score at the 95th percentile, for example, nationally across your entire country. You are looking for students who are the most talented students, the highest performing students in the school where you're going to put the services. That's a very different lens on this, but we know it makes a huge difference. Again, I've only got a couple minutes left, so I'm not going to dive into this other than to say we have plenty of evidence now that portability isn't a very big issue, and that lower standards, surprisingly enough, tend not to happen. The best example I can give is we only have a couple studies on this now, but those studies argue that if you identify students with local norms and you identify another group of students with national norms or like district norms, city norms, after 2 to 3 years, teachers can't tell you which group the students started in. So the students using local norms who were presumably a little bit behind because of lack of opportunity, they have such a thirst for challenge again that they catch up very, very quickly while everyone is moving ahead. That's what we're aiming to do here. Give low-income students a chance, give them the opportunity, support them the right way. They will take off and fly very, very quickly. We have done one big study in the States comparing different norms and how it would change racial composition. What we found, I don't have time to go into the weeds here, but what we generally found was that a combination of local norms and national norms tended to provide the most opportunity to the most students, which I think is really, really important. So basically, look for more potentially talented students. We know how to do that so much better than we used to. You will find them everywhere, and it will transform your schools. Another chart, let's pretend I talked about that. I think this next point is really important. What I tell people is grow the pie. The point of closing these gaps in having more diverse students within advanced education services is not to change who you give the services to, it's to provide more services. You cannot close excellence gaps if you keep supply tightly constrained. We get a lot of pushback on this point. I really don't understand that, to be honest. If all of education is about providing opportunity, let's provide more opportunity. Everyone benefits when you see all these students who didn't have the opportunities before to really, really advance. So grow more pie. That's my favorite child eating pie image. Grow more pie. Don't divide the same pie up differently. All right, I'm going to skip ahead here. And I would also say, people with an education talk about the use of local norms like it is the craziest thing ever. We use local norms in all of our schools, communities, youth development activities all the time, especially in sports, but also in academics. And so this sort of knee-jerk aversion to local norms, there's no question that your community uses them now. So it's not that crazy of a concept. It's actually very, very reasonable. All right, let me just finish up here by saying I have written a series of more applied columns on how schools can tackle excellence gaps. We have about 4 or 5 more to go in this series. Fortunately, it is free to access this online magazine, and if you contact me, I can also share copies personally. So. Let me leave my contact information up while I finish here. When I talked about excellence gaps at first, the first 7 or 8 years, I remember Dr. Julia Roberts coming up to me after one talk, and she said, this is so important, but man, this is so depressing. Like, this problem is huge. It's causing societal issues in every country. We've got to get this figured out. You know what? 5 years later, I am very optimistic now. I think we are going to solve this during our lifetimes. We've seen such an explosion of studies, intervention programs, pilot projects. Everyone is getting serious about it. I mean, obviously, we're having this special conference just on achievement gaps with advanced students, and I just really think that we are going to get this figured out within the next decade, and my colleagues and I are certainly happy to be partners as we do that. So thank you for your time. I know I went through this very, very quickly. If you would like copies of all the slides I have, including the ones that I had to skip over, please just let me know. And I will send them to you. Thank you very much.
Dear Jonathan, we heard a great lecture about the topic of excellence gap, and I'm very happy that we have this discussion now. You mentioned lots of details about the topic of excellence gap and achievement gap, so thank you really for this great lecture. But now we have some time to go into more details about the topic. But before we go into these details, I would like to ask a kind of personal question, because I think that in Hungary and in Europe, we usually aware of your research concerning creativity. Whereas studying the achievement gap is also a major part of your professional activity. Could you please tell us a few words about how you came across the topic? What were your personal motives to studying it, or why do you find why do you consider it important personally?
That's a really interesting question. It's always funny to me how my friends in different parts of the world, or even my friends in my own country, just how they see you and your work. So in Europe and East Asia, for the most part, they see me as a creativity person. He's the creativity guy. Here at home, they generally don't see me that way at all. People in certain parts of the country see me as an education policy person. That's what they ask me to help with. But then within the world of gifted ed here, they really see me as someone who focuses on these equity issues. So it's just kind of fascinating, just how people decide that they see you, and which is one reason why I am so excited to be speaking to all of my ECHA colleagues about something other than creativity this time, because I probably spend most of my time doing this work, actually, and like I kind of said during the talk, Szilvia, I mean, I was really doing policy work for the most part. And it was me sitting around one day thinking, how can I bring these worlds together? That really kind of led to this concept of thinking about excellence gaps. And I should also say, the concept, I just grew frustrated seeing all my friends and colleagues spend so much effort and time working so hard to get policymakers to think about gifted students. And it's such hard work that they define success in most cases as not losing that much. You never want to be an advocate in a situation where victory is not losing too much. And I started to wonder if it was the message that we were using. And I was interacting with lots of policymakers at every different level. And I started to play around with different language. And it was the people may not believe in gifted students and in gifted education everyone believes in excellence. And that's where we started to play with this idea of excellence gaps rather than achievement gaps and rather than gifted education. Some of our excellence gaps work doesn't use the word gifted once. But we do find it effective in helping argue for services for those students. So it's been a very interesting journey.
Yeah, and I remember that you referred to this in your presentation, but I think that we should make it very explicit and clear. What is the difference between achievement gap and excellence gap? Because sometimes you used both these terms in your presentation. What's the difference between them?
Achievement gaps to me are the broader term. And so there are lots of different achievement gaps. There's that minimum competency gap, which tends to be the focus in most countries, but there are lots of different gaps, right? And the excellence gap is just one of those achievement gaps at those higher levels of student outcomes, student achievement. And I should say, we have them in more than just academics. We have them in sports, the arts, music. There are big excellence gaps in all these different areas, just like there are big achievement gaps much more globally. So achievement gaps, the more global term, we're focused pretty much on those excellence gaps.
Yes, and most of your work refer to the excellence gap. I read one of your articles, and its title impressed me really very much. The title was Smart People or Smart Context. I think that that's a great title, but what does this exactly refer to? What does this expression smart context mean? I think it's, again, a very interesting and new concept in this area.
Yeah, it's a concept that we've adapted from other social science fields. It's a very socioculturally defined Vygotskian concept, and we don't use it a lot within gifted ed, advanced ed, and the more that we work on it, I really believe that we should. And the whole idea is that a person doesn't achieve impressive advanced outcomes. It's the person within their given context achieves those outcomes. And so we are so used to pointing to high achievers. I'll just take a somewhat stereotypical example. Let's take Steve Jobs, right? Did all these amazing things with technology, design, creativity. We have these now because of him largely. That's really amazing, right? It's so easy for us to point to him and say, well, he was just different than everyone else. He was just a genius. Yeah, but he also had a really first-class education. He had he was a foster child, I believe, and he got adopted into a very supportive family. He surrounded himself with very supportive, very smart friends. It wasn't just him. It was him and lots of other things within his social network, within his cultural context. He was working at the time in a country, my own, that had very little technology regulation. So they could push envelopes that they normally wouldn't have been able to, push if he had been working in a different field. And so it was all these other variables that helped him achieve what he did. Of course, I'm in no way saying that he didn't do those things. He did. But he had lots of help, even if it didn't look like help, right? And that's why smart contexts are so important. The more that we work with smart contexts, we've started to see that it's a big equity issue. If you start to think about talent as not just being solely within a student's head, but within their head and their entire cultural context, if a low-income student doesn't capitalize on all their talent, it helps us understand that it's not their fault. It's the whole system that has been designed not to support their talent development. By stepping back and saying, okay, what is it, not just about the context, but the context in this particular student that's causing them not to be able to perform at really advanced levels. It takes us away from blaming the child and gets us focusing more on what haven't we designed correctly so that the child can thrive. And that's why we're so excited about this idea of smart context. It's a much broader, much more inclusive, I think, much more optimistic, we can solve this problem attitude.
But knowing the meaning of smart context, another concept comes into the picture, which is opportunity gap, which is again a kind of gap. So in addition to achievement gap and excellence gap, opportunity gap comes into the picture. How would you define this?
We tend in our own work to sort of combine opportunity gaps, resource gaps, all those gaps under the broader concept of excellence gaps. But there is no question that there are huge opportunity gaps. And I've never been in any country visiting schools where you didn't see opportunity gaps. They are everywhere. It's just kind of how society has developed. Now, many countries have done a lot more to help close those opportunity gaps, especially for lower income students. That's really important work that has to be done. But you know what? We are also finding that it's not just about providing opportunities. Like you can easily say, oh, we're going to provide opportunities. We do that a lot within education across countries, and it doesn't result in changes to student achievement. And so that's the problem here, I think, is that we need to be focusing on how do we offer the opportunities when we close those opportunity gaps. So for example, if you live in a country or a region of a country where you don't have very good transportation, if the opportunity isn't close to where you live, how do you get there? If it's 3 or 4 kilometers away, that's a million miles to a low-income family sometimes. How do you get the opportunity to the student? So where you place the opportunity is really, really important. Making sure that the costs of opportunity are as low as possible, if not no cost, is really important. But then something that we've only seen this in a couple studies now, but we hear similar stories anecdotally all over the world. And that is, even if you do all those things, you create really good opportunities. You make sure that low-income students, for example, have access to them. If you make sure that there's a very low barrier to entry, so transportation isn't an issue, high fees aren't an issue. Even if you do all that, low-income students will often tend not to participate, especially in very urban areas and very rural areas. And the more that we've talked to educators, we realize that many of us, and this is totally understandable, we all view opportunity through a middle class, upper middle class lens, which is that we have the social capital to understand that certain opportunities are very important for our students' future potential, right? So as parents, we see an opportunity. We have that knowledge to know that that's a really important opportunity and that we can seize it for our children and that they will benefit from it. But if you've lived in a community that hasn't had those opportunities before, and you may distrust government, you may distrust schools, and you may have good reason to not trust them. Someone says, oh, here's a great opportunity for you. if you're not looking at it through a middle-class lens, you may get suspicious of that opportunity and you don't seize it for your child. And so it's not just about creating the opportunity, making it easy for the child to do the opportunity. We're finding in our own intervention studies, it works so much better to get them there if you then work with the families. So you have to work with the families to get them to understand that the opportunity is valuable and that you have their kids' best interest in mind. And if I can give a really quick example of this, we have had an after-school excellence gap intervention program in New York City now for about 3 years, give or take, and we're starting to expand it to other parts of the country. This is in a very poor neighborhood, very, very poor, not a lot of opportunity. I think it's safe to say this was the first sort of gifted advanced learning opportunity that this community has ever had. Like we found in that study that I talked about, we found students who were already working above grade level, even in this very, very, very poor school in this very poor neighborhood. And these students were amazing. And we found them, we used screening with local norms, we put everything in place. But then we said, okay, we're gonna put it after school in their same school. It's going to be free, so they don't have to pay. They don't have to travel. Everything is great. But we didn't want to make that mistake where we didn't talk to the families. So we had all these different sessions where the families could meet with us. Well, families can't all meet at the same time, right? So we had to have some meetings at 5 o'clock in the morning before people went off to work or as they were getting home from work. We had to have some at 9 o'clock at night. In the end, for 40 students, I think we had to have 9 parent sessions just because they weren't all on that same schedule. They were desperately trying to provide for their families. They didn't have a lot of free time. So we had to meet them when it was convenient for them, to help them understand the opportunity, essentially to help them gain that social capital that someone living in the suburbs already has. It's not their fault that they didn't have it. And so we helped provide it to them. And then they could make their decision for their child. And I believe 100% decided to do it in the end, and every single student showed up. But if we had not done those parent sessions, or we hadn't done 9 of them, maybe none of them would have showed up. And that would have been bad. So opportunity gaps, even something as simple as opportunity gaps, we have learned so much in the past 5 to 6 years about how to help families take advantage of opportunities.
Mm-hmm. I think that all what you have said so far leads to a very important issue, which is the definition of giftedness, or a new approach to the concept of giftedness. Because I think that the gifted student population is usually far less diverse than the student body itself. So certain groups are definitely underrepresented, just you mentioned it. So if we want to attain this diversity also in the field of gifted education, maybe the notion of giftedness or the concept of giftedness should be extended. So, what do you think that how can you define talent or giftedness in a so-called achievement gap friendly way? So, do you need a new definition for giftedness now? What do you think?
I don't think this is a really good question. It's a very complicated question, right? And we've only been arguing about this for about 100 years, probably, right? I think we're getting better about not being too rigid about our definitions. Whenever I go into a school and they tell me, oh yes, we have gifted students. They focus so much on the student, boy, that I have to be honest, that really gets me nervous. Because again, you're focusing on smart students and not smart contexts. And it's the context which is what we tend to make mistakes about. And so maybe this is strange for me to say, and I'm going to regret saying it, but I don't care that much about the definition. I'm looking for bright students who have special learning needs and special talents, who with the right support can go on and do great things. And when we think about it in those terms, again, providing smart contexts to help every student who has talents move forward and develop those talents in really impressive ways, that benefits the student, that benefits their family, it benefits their neighborhood community, and it benefits all of us culturally, economically, politically. Having more students being able to work at very advanced levels is good for every single person. It's a very good thing. The problem is that we've created definitions and identification systems and even service delivery systems, which have become so restrictive and I would say too rigid. I used to think that when my professors back when I was in school told me about gifted education programs where students were identified using things like IQ scores, for example, and that like the cutoff would be 122 IQ, and a student would have a 120 IQ, and so they wouldn't receive advanced services. Like I thought that was always just kind of a story to scare us. I didn't think it was real until I became an elementary school teacher and I saw it happen. And I still see it happen today when I go to work in schools, just very rigid approaches. And what's the difference between a student with an IQ of 120 and 122? Or 110 or 130. I think we can get caught up in those numbers and data sometimes when all of those students probably need smart contexts to help them develop their talents in some way, shape, or form. It's going to be different for every student, and that's okay. A piece of this, which has really annoyed me lately, so you're going to have to hear about it, is going into school districts and talking about universal screening with local norms and having people in the school district tell me, well, we have a set curriculum for gifted students. We don't know if these new students can handle the work. I think that's a real regrettable attitude. I know where it comes from. I totally understand it. But this, to me, gifted education, advanced education is about meeting talented students where they are and helping them get somewhere where they want to be. And so to say, oh no, we only have one curriculum for every student and it has to be this way, that just strikes me as a very narrow, overly selective, again, rigid way to think about it. That's one reason why I love sort of the talent network approach that so many countries within ECHA use, and then obviously you have them across the whole continent, that really focuses more on mentoring. And what is mentoring if not a flexible approach to advanced service delivery, right? Where you figure out where a student is, you see their potential, and you help them out along the way so that they can reach that potential. I really don't care what their test scores are. Because in the end, I mean, you don't know what my test scores are. I don't know what yours are, but I know you're a talented person. I would hope you think that I'm at least a little bit talented. And so that's all that matters after you leave school. So it just getting away from rigid, not even definitions, conceptions of how we find students and how we provide services. I think that's probably where the field is going to end up in 10 or 20 years. So I don't see why we shouldn't start working toward it now.
Yeah. So can we say that this network view or systemic view of talent or giftedness would lead a kind of paradigm shift in the whole area, in gifted education in general? It sounds like this.
I mean, I hope so. I would argue we haven't seen a major paradigm shift in a number of years. I think in the last decade, we have seen things change. And this is what usually happens in fields when you sort of change generations. And another reason why I'm very optimistic about the future of gifted education, advanced education, is that we have so many great early career people coming into the field with just very fresh perspectives, very different and new ways of looking at these issues. And that's one reason why I think we are seeing some of these paradigms shift a little bit. It's a big generational change. And you know, we had the post-war generation. I think most countries had that, right? Between the people born between the 1940s and the early 1960s. That was a huge wave of people. Then we have people like me born after that. There's not a lot of us. And now we have these younger generations coming that are even bigger than the post-war generation. And so we kind of have these two groups moving through. We still have some of the first group active. We have a few of us here, but then we have this huge group coming up behind us. And I'm very optimistic. In the United States, we called them Millennials, Generation Z. Those groups are huge, and they are going to change the entire world's culture. They're starting to come into the field now, which is really exciting. I think we need to be open to the ways that they challenge us to think and the ways that they think differently. It would be very easy for us to say, those are crazy ideas, it'll never work. Maybe they will. And I think we have to be open to it. And we're seeing this across countries now, right? We're just seeing this just new generation of leaders come in their 20s and 30s and early 40s even. And I just think it's terribly exciting. And they are going to change the world for us.
Oh, sounds exciting. Yeah. You just mentioned the test scores, and I also think that we should speak a little bit about identificational issues or ability screening or testing or early testing, because I think it is a controversial issue in gifted education in general. Some say that maybe early identification is really the solution, because if you detect talent in time, then you can provide appropriate educational context in time. But some others say that if you do some early measurement or early assessment, you just exactly prevent the child to get into the right educational program, because you just measure his or her context instead of the person. So
exactly.
I think that it's really interesting to think about where is the place of talent identification or ability screening within this field.
These are very controversial issues, as you said. And I change my mind about the age issue all the time. I mean, clearly, there are students who by the time we first interact with them, it's very clear that they are very talented and that any sort of normal school curriculum will not be adequate, and that they will be very bored and they will burn out quickly. That's a huge problem, obviously. At the same time, let me take a step back here. Many of you know Professor Tracy Cross here in the States. I heard him talk about this once, just talking about the testing issue. And he used a framing device that I've always thought was very helpful. And so I want to give him credit for this. But we were having a conversation, a small group of us, and he said, the problem with the test isn't false positives, right? If someone does well on an assessment, the odds are very good that they have gifts, talents, skills, however you want to think about it, in whatever that test is measuring. So there's not many false positives. But then he said, and this has always stuck with me, we can never be sure about the false negatives, right? You definitely are missing kids. And the younger they are, I definitely worry that the false negatives increase exponentially. If you want to identify early, great. But in order not to increase excellence gaps, you'd have to convince me of the steps you're taking to find as many of the false negatives as you possibly can. Multiple indicator systems are one way to do it. Having flexible participation, self-nominations are other ways to do it. I just think it's easier to do all those things when students are a little bit older, and it becomes more feasible to avoid that false negative problem. And we need to be honest about this, right? That the false negatives generally disproportionately impact low-income students. And so how can you guard against those false negatives? If people come up with systems that do that with very young students, I have no problem. Then I really don't care that much about age, and I would agree that finding these students early is very, very helpful. A very different approach is to identify later and just assume there are lots of talented students at younger ages, and put in a more flexible set of curricula, instructional opportunities, et cetera, early on that most students participate in. If you do that carefully, I think it also provides identification assistance, because you'll see low-income students who start to thrive who you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. So it is one of those things where if you provide the opportunities, watch to see who seizes the opportunities. You're going to pick up some false negatives that you otherwise would have missed with, say, a standardized test of 4 or 5 year olds. Mm-hmm. So I think there are ways to do it that get us to the same aims and don't expand excellence gaps, but actually shrink excellence gaps as young as possible. I am not saying that that's easy, but I think there are enough schools now trying it that we will soon have very good data to give us insight on whether this works.
Yeah, identification is really a difficult issue, but can you give us some really practical recommendations what to do or what to avoid? Maybe not very general remarks, because it depends on the situation and depends on the context, of course, but maybe can you have some recommendations what to avoid during the talent identification process?
Yeah, I can give some very specific things that I think hold across countries and cultures. We've generally always used nomination systems in most countries, and even here, a lot of districts still use nomination things. Um, uh, it's the law in some places. I wish it wasn't, because I don't think nominations help us. I really do think if you're looking for potentially talented students, you need to look at every single student, not the students whose parents know the system and know all about the programs. And so I think, just again, universally screening is critically important. I think another mistake that people make, appeals processes. So if you're an upper income student and your parents nominate you, and for whatever reason, the decision is made by the school that you probably don't need advanced services, but if you have an appeals process where parents can then go and argue for your child to be reconsidered, I've never been in a school district where the appeals process wasn't primarily upper income parents. Again, social capital, right? They know how the game works. Other parents who could appeal don't, because they don't know about it, or they don't understand it, or they hear a rumor that, low income students are never successful. So appeals processes should be used very carefully. I totally see the need for them, but they are too often abused, and I think it becomes a big excellence gap issue. Another area, I guess I'm on point number 3, is teacher ratings, teacher recommendations have become very controversial, and for good reason, I think. I have a few colleagues who have said, you should never use teacher input into the process, because several studies have shown now that teachers have implicit bias, and so they tend not to think of that low income Black student, Latinx student, migrant student as being talented just because of that label. I personally have never met a teacher who would do that on purpose, but we're all human, and we all have stereotypes and biases that we have to deal with. And so several people have said, just don't include teacher information. Here's why I think that's a really big mistake. I was in a school district once, and they had taken teacher nominations, and they had taken them from early in their process and moved them to the very end of the process. They didn't use these terms, but they used teacher input as a safety net and not a gatekeeping function. Traditionally, we use teacher input as a gatekeeping function. I love the idea of turning teachers from gatekeepers into that safety net for, for bright students. One, I think it matches why people are teachers, right? They want to help their students. Why are we making them gatekeepers? Most teachers don't have the training to do that well. You could spend the money on that training. Why not just make them safety nets where their input is only about providing opportunity? So what the school district did was they would do all their testing, universal screening, local norms. Then they sat down with every single teacher one-on-one. They shared the data, and they said, look, we've found this student, and this student. They were not asked to give input on those students. They were asked to give input on any other student in their class who they would have missed. And every single teacher, I I was there for one day in one school watching, and every single teacher quickly came up with at least one student in their class that they thought had been missed. And they made great points about, why the student doesn't test well. In one case, it was a student from Nigeria, I believe. And he was just figuring out English, American schools, trying to make friends. Fantastic creative problem solver. Really good in sort of STEM areas, engineering. But he just didn't have the test taking skills in English yet to do well. The identification team had missed that. His teacher didn't miss it and said, you really have to consider this student. So I think being smart about how we empower teachers to, again, provide opportunity, something that small, moving teacher input from gatekeeping to a safety net can make a huge difference in what your pool of talented students looks like. So those are just three things off the top of my head that I think everyone can do tomorrow that really make a big difference.
Yes, great ideas, really, thank you. So I have two more questions. Both of them are about kind of final take-home messages. The first question is about the educational policy implications of all what you have said so far. So what do you think, what kind of steps or strategies are necessary for decision makers to close or at least to narrow the achievement gap or excellence gap? What would you recommend for policymakers or decision makers?
Yeah, if your country or state, region within your country has any sort of school accountability mechanisms, they probably don't call it that. It's usually different terms in different countries. Here it's mostly called accountability systems, but I know it's different everywhere. You probably have some. I think it is absolutely imperative that schools and educators get credit for talent development, for helping bright students develop their talents. I think that is absolutely needed. But they should also get credit for closing excellence gaps and making progress. I know of very few places around the world where those metrics are really in place. I think in a lot of countries, we give schools credit for closing those minimum competency achievement gaps, which again, absolutely we should all do all the time. But I think that closing excellence gaps should be done all the time in every school, and that we should be holding up schools that, for example, have high percentages of low income students, and finds ways to send them all to really good universities. Like that's a really important outcome for all of us. And even if you don't have many low income students, but you're still doing a good job of helping them learn, develop those talents, and really excel and thrive, you should get credit for that. And most of our education systems, I think pretty much all of them right now, do not give you credit for that. So are we surprised when educators tell us, yes, it's very important, but we just don't have time to focus on it. We have to worry about students who are struggling just to get up to grade level. I understand that mindset. I run into it here all the time. I just think every student has equal worth. And I think just because a student is more talented and needs to be challenged more, they have the same exact right to learn as much every single year as someone who needs more help. And we should absolutely help them too. It doesn't have to be either or. And I think in most countries it is either or. So yeah, I kind of took that question in a very different direction, but I think the biggest policy thing is work indicators for advanced achievement and closing excellence gaps into your education policy accountability systems, or your monitoring systems, or school tables, they're called in some countries. Something that's not observed is by definition invisible. Make policymakers observe this, and I think that that's the foundation that's going to allow us to make changes even more quickly to help all these students.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what would you recommend to teachers or professionals or advocates of gifted education? Because I think that most of our listeners are professionals who are quite sensitive for this issue. That's why they are here. That's why they are listening us. So what can they, or what can we do, let's say, from tomorrow? What can we change in our practice to be more sensitive to this topic?
Boy, that's a great question. I will admit, I forgot you were going to ask this question. So this is a really good one. The words you use matter. And if you go up to a friend who you think may be sympathetic to these issues, and you start out, hey, what do you think about gifted kids and gifted education? I don't think that's the best way to have that conversation, because you have no idea what's happened in their family history that makes them in favor of gifted education or hate it. I think you go in and you start talking about excellence, and if your friends are talking about, the economy needs to be changed, et cetera, sure. One way to do it, wouldn't it be cool if we took all these students who aren't having opportunities to be really excellent? Wouldn't it be awesome if we found ways to get them into the workforce and have them be highly motivated, very creative, having really been challenged in school? In my experience, most people say, yeah, that would be awesome if we could only figure it out. And that's when I say, well, surprise, surprise, we actually kind of know how to do that now. That's not a mystery anymore. I mean, and even, 7, 8 years ago, it was harder for us to have that conversation. Now we can have that conversation intelligently, and we do have specific strategies. And I probably go into school districts at least a dozen times per year, and I'm having these conversations with school board members, parents, principals, some who hate the topic. They just don't think this is important in any way, shape, or form. And I have yet to not be able to slowly turn them around to think that this is much more important. And the way we do it is to just share strategies and talk about, if I know that the word gifted makes them nervous, gifted, I never use the term. I just talk about advanced learning. You can be against gifted. You can't be against advanced learning. Advanced skill development, talent development. The words we use matter to other people. And so I really encourage people to sort of be flexible about that. But again, this is a point I made earlier, and I said it in a different way during my talk. But if we figure this out, it is good for everybody at every level, right? It helps the student. It will change their life forever. If that happens, it changes their family's life. It changes their neighborhood's life when, advanced achievement across domains starts to be valued. That is transformative. We know that. They go into the workforce. It changes the people that they're working with. It does. It creates much more cultural value when we have so many talented people contributing to who we are and what we do, a huge cultural value. And it has a massive economic impact. And then you're building social capital that they will then have to help their children repeat this cycle in very positive ways. So it's not, I've heard people say, sometimes you have to argue that it's about the student or it's about society. In my experience, it's better if you argue it's about everybody. This is really about rethinking the functional value and how we organize and deliver one of our most important shared values, which is education and excellence.
Oh, final great words. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for joining us. I really enjoyed the conversation with you, and I hope that our listeners enjoyed it too. Dear listeners, thank you very much for your attention.